The morning I wore my grandfather's watch to a job interview, I had no idea it would change my entire life. It was a gray February Tuesday in Denver. I stood in front of the mirror in my grandfather's apartment on Colfax Avenue, adjusting the collar of my best blouse, and tried to convince my reflection that everything was going to be fine. It was not convincing. My name is Sarah Whitfield. I was 26 years old, civil engineering degree from the University of Colorado, Denver. 2 months earlier, I had watched my grandfather, Robert, funny, stubborn, impossibly proud grandfather Robert, take his last breath in a Colorado Springs hospital room while machines beeped their quiet, indifferent farewell. I had come to Denver because there was nothing left for me in Colorado Springs. My mother had died when I was 11, my father had moved away when I was 17, and my grandfather had been, for as long as I could remember, the only person on earth who made me feel entirely, unconditionally known. Now, he was gone, and I had $4,000, 3 months of grace on his empty apartment, and a job interview in 90 minutes. Before I left, I did what I had done every morning since the funeral. I lifted the watch from the bedside table. A vintage Hamilton from the 1950s, scratched crystal face, a leather strap repaired twice with electrical tape, my grandfather's solution to most mechanical problems. The hands still moved, the second hand still swept its quiet circle. On the case back, scratched in my grandfather's architectural handwriting, were 4 words: "Everything will be fine." He had scratched them there himself, he once told me, right after my grandmother died. A reminder, a promise to himself. I fastened the watch around my wrist. It was too large. His wrists had been a draftsman's wrists, broad and certain. It slid a little as I moved. I wore it anyway. "This is for you, Grandpa," I whispered to the empty apartment, "whether it goes well or whether it doesn't." The offices of Summit Infrastructure Group were on the 8th floor of Republic Plaza, efficient, precise, and faintly intimidating, a firm that had completed 47 major infrastructure projects across Colorado and the American West. The waiting area held 4 other candidates, all men, all in expensive suits with leather portfolios. One of them looked at my watch with a faint expression I had learned over the course of my engineering degree to translate accurately, "She doesn't belong here." I looked back at him with the expression I had developed in response, "Watch me." A young woman with a headset and a clipboard appeared. "Sarah Whitfield?" I stood. I smoothed my blouse. I followed her down a corridor. The office at the end of the corridor belonged to Daniel Hartley, CEO of Summit Infrastructure Group, MIT graduate class of 1989, the kind of face weathered not by sun, but by decades of solving difficult problems, deeply lined, precise, with the particular authority of a man who has spent 30 years earning the right to be calm. He rose when I entered, which I had not expected. He extended his hand. He sat. He opened my folder. He read without speaking, a technique I recognized and did not allow to unsettle me. Then he looked up, and his eyes went directly to the watch on my wrist. Not a glance, not a polite flicker, a long, arrested, almost stricken look, the look of recognition, not curiosity. The interview proceeded. He asked about my degree, my thesis, my internship experience, my understanding of infrastructure development in the American West. I answered everything. I had spent 6 days preparing, and my grandfather had spent 60 years teaching me that preparation was the only honest form of confidence. Then Daniel Hartley put down his pen, leaned back in his chair, and said very quietly, "May I ask about the watch?" It was my grandfather's. Something moved across his face, a tightening, a tremor, gone almost before it arrived. "Your grandfather, what was his name?" "Robert James Whitfield. He passed away in December." Daniel Hartley stood up slowly. He crossed to the window and stood with his back to me for a long moment. When he turned around, his eyes were wet. "Robert James," he said, not a question, a confirmation. He had a daughter named Helen. Helen was my mother, I said. She died when I was 11. Daniel sat back down with the careful, deliberate movement of a man making sure his legs would hold him. Helen, he said softly, was my sister. There are moments that divide a life cleanly between before and after. That was mine. Daniel's full name was Daniel Robert Hartley. He had been born Daniel Robert Whitfield, the eldest child of Robert James Whitfield in Colorado Springs in 1967. His parents had separated when he was 7 and my mother was 4. His mother had taken him to Albuquerque, where her family lived. His father, my grandfather Robert, had kept my mother. Daniel had been adopted by his stepfather, taken that family's name, and searched for his father and sister for 30 years. He had found a trail that went cold in 2003 when a fire destroyed 2 decades of Colorado civil records. And then, on a gray February morning, I walked into his office wearing a vintage Hamilton watch with 4 words scratched on the caseback of his father's handwriting. He showed me a photograph, kept in a small envelope, opened and refolded so many times the paper had gone soft at the creases. Black and white, slightly overexposed, 2 small children on the steps of a house. The older child, a boy perhaps of 7, squinting into the sun with an expression of profound seriousness. The younger one, a girl of 3 or 4, laughing at something outside the frame. I recognized the laugh. I had seen it in photographs of my own mother. I had grown up being told I had my mother's laugh. I had never known where my mother's laugh came from. Now I was looking at the answer. Daniel had hired an investigator in 2013. He found a record of Helen Whitfield in Colorado Springs, married name Helen Whitfield Morrison, deceased 2011. A daughter was listed, but the details were incomplete. He hadn't known my name. He hadn't known where I was. Then he opened the desk drawer again and produced another Hamilton watch, identical to mine in every respect, except the strap was newer. He placed it on the desk beside my wrist. Same scratched crystal face, same swept second hand, same worn numerals, same 4 words on the caseback. Everything will be fine. My grandfather had sent it to Daniel when he was 12 through her mother. No letter, just the watch and those 4 words on a piece of paper. A father reaching through the distance with the only language he had. We sat together for a long time. Outside the window, Denver went about its business. The Rocky Mountains stood in their patient white silence above the city, the way they had stood above every human thing that had ever happened in this valley. Eventually, Daniel said there was a place he knew, a diner on Larimer Street, quiet, no phones. Could I come that evening? I thought of my $4,000 and my grandfather's empty apartment and the 3 months of grace I had before I needed to find my footing in this city. Yes, I can come.
Then, as if remembering where we were and what we had been doing when all of this began, Daniel looked at my folder and back at me with the first hint of a smile. "You're hired," he said. "Whatever else needs to be said tonight, professionally, you're exactly what this team needs." I did not cry in Daniel Hartley's office. I had promised myself I would not cry in the interview. I cried in the elevator on the way down, quietly, with my hand pressed to my mouth, the Hamilton watch cool and solid against my wrist. Everything will be fine. For the first time in months, I thought he might have been right. That evening at the diner on Larimer Street, Daniel told me about his childhood in Albuquerque, the smallness of the apartment, the industrial cold, the way he had thrown himself into mathematics and drawing because they rewarded precision and didn't require explanations. He was always drawing buildings, he said, from the time I was 8 or 9. My stepfather thought it was strange. My mother said it was because I had my father's hands. He had enrolled at MIT in 1985, studied civil engineering, came back to Colorado just as the early 90s recession was hollowing out the construction industry. He worked for the Colorado Department of Transportation through the 90s, watching a state try to keep pace with a population. In 2001, with 2 colleagues and a bank loan he called heroically optimistic, he founded Summit Infrastructure Group. There was so much that needed to be built, he said, with a reverence that sounded like a vocation. We were engineers in a state that needed to rebuild itself faster than anyone had planned. It was overwhelming, and at the same time, extraordinary. He smiled, a genuine smile born of real memory. I thought, my mother had a smile like that. I had seen it in photographs. As a child, I had wondered where it came from. Now I knew. I told him about my mother in return, the small house in Colorado Springs, the mathematics teacher who read aloud every night, the illness she kept quiet from everyone so she could spend her remaining time preparing me and my grandfather and everything around us for what was coming. She was brave, I said, not dramatically. She just didn't make it larger than it was. She made sure I had everything I needed. Then she quickly passed away. She was extraordinary, Daniel said. She was, I said. She was the kind of person who made everyone around her feel like the world was manageable. I wish I had known her, he said. I wish I had found her in time. Near the end of the evening, he showed me one more thing he had been carrying. A letter, written on graph paper, the kind draftsmen used, in my grandfather's handwriting, dated 2003, sent to an address in Albuquerque, received, filed, and never forgotten. Daniel, I have looked for you. I hope this finds you. Your sister Helen is well. She has a daughter now, Sarah, born 1999. She is a good child, very serious, very curious about everything. She looks at buildings the way you used to look at buildings. I thought you would want to know. I am sorry I could not do better. Come if you can. Your father, Robert. I read it twice, then folded it carefully along its original creases and held it in both hands. He looked for you, I said. I know, Daniel said. I looked up at him. She looks at buildings the way you used to look at buildings. He knew. He knew we were the same, and he didn't even know you yet. Daniel Hartley, the man who had built 47 infrastructure projects, who had negotiated contracts with agencies and banks and international partners for 30 years, pressed his fingers briefly to his eyes and said nothing for a long moment. Then, you should meet my family. Daniel's home was in Cherry Creek, a quiet street climbing toward the foothills, pale brick, a garden with apple trees and rose bushes and a birch tree he had planted himself the year his first son was born. Maggie opened the door before I had time to knock. Perhaps 55, warm brown eyes, the specific calm of a woman who had decided long ago to meet whatever arrives at her door with equanimity. She had been told everything. She apparently had received the news that her husband had found his long-lost niece by saying, "Thank God," and immediately begun to plan a dinner. She took my face in both hands and looked at me for a moment. Welcome home. Those 2 words broke something loose in my chest that had been calcifying for years. Daniel and Maggie had 3 children, Ethan, 28, an architect, Lily, 25, finishing a master's in environmental engineering, Jake, 22, in his final year of construction management. All 3 were there. All 3 had been thoroughly briefed. Ethan shook my hand with the earnest intensity of someone who had decided doing this well mattered. "I've read your thesis abstract," he said immediately. "The section on permafrost foundations is really rigorous. Have you looked at the Norwegian research on helical pile systems?" I stared at him, then laughed. A real laugh, the involuntary kind. "I have," I said. "I have thoughts on it. Good, we can argue about it properly later." Lily hugged me without preamble. "I've wanted a sister my whole life. Ethan is useless, and Jake thinks he's funny." "I am funny," Jake said from somewhere behind her. Dinner was the kind I had not sat down to since my grandfather's house in Colorado Springs. Pot roast, slow braised until it fell apart. Beef stew fragrant enough to make the whole house smell of home. Cornbread fresh from the oven. We sat at a table extended to its maximum length and still felt barely large enough, and talked until the plates were cleared and the tea came and the conversation became something deeper, the kind that only happens when the food is finished and there's nowhere else to be. After dinner, when the younger ones had retreated to the living room and Daniel had gone to find something he wanted to show me, Maggie sat beside me at the kitchen table with her tea. She looked at me. "How are you? Are you all right?" It was such a direct question and so gently asked that I found myself answering it honestly rather than reassuringly, which is what I usually do. "I don't know yet," I said. "I think I will be. I think I am more all right than I was 2 months ago. It's like, you know when you've been cold for a very long time and you come inside and the warmth doesn't feel comfortable yet. It almost feels too much. It's like that." Maggie nodded slowly. "That is exactly the right way to describe it. And the answer is stay. Stay until it feels comfortable. That is all that is required." Daniel returned with a box and set a box on the kitchen table. The cardboard kind that stationery comes in, sealed with tape, labeled in marker, "Robert Whitefield Documents." Inside, in careful plastic sleeves, were the remnants of my grandfather's life. A photograph of a young Robert Whitefield at a drafting table, perhaps 30 years old, pencil behind his ear, the expression of a man entirely absorbed in something he loves. And at the bottom, a drawing, a blueprint, hand-drawn on pale blue tracing paper, the kind engineers used before computer drafting. A small house, every dimension noted in my grandfather's precise handwriting. Foundation plan, elevation views, section drawings. A house designed with the full rigor of a professional draftsman for someone he loved. At the bottom of the sheet, in the title block, "To Helen and Daniel, a house for when we are all together again." He had drawn it in 1985. None of us spoke for a long time. Daniel said finally, "He never stopped." I looked at the blueprint, the neat staircase, the generous kitchen, the 2 bedrooms side by side, and felt something that was grief and gratitude and the particular piercing beauty of a love that persists through decades of silence, unchanged, undimmed, as patient as the mountains visible on a clear day from the end of this street. I said, "We should build it." Daniel looked at me. "Not this exactly, not literally, but we're engineers. We could adapt it. We could build something that honors what he designed. It doesn't have to be a house. It could be part of the affordable housing project, something that carries this forward." Daniel looked at me for a long moment, and then he smiled, a full, unguarded, complete smile, the kind I had not seen from him yet, the kind that looked exactly like my mother's photograph and exactly like Ethan's laugh. "Your grandfather," he said, "would have been very proud of you." 6 months after I arrived for the interview on the 8th floor of Republic Plaza, Summit Infrastructure Group broke ground on the Robert Whitfield Sustainable Housing Development in Cherry Creek. The name had been Daniel's idea. 48 homes, solar thermal heating, rainwater capture, passive ventilation, a shared community garden, and at the center of the site, adapted from the blueprint in that cardboard box, a community center that followed, in its proportions and its generous kitchen and its 2 main rooms side by side, the outline of the house my grandfather had drawn in 1985 for the children he couldn't reach. I was site lead on the construction phase. I was 26 years old and had been a professional engineer for 7 months, and I did not make my project manager, Claire, regret giving me the role. I came in before most people had gone, not to prove myself, but because I could not stop. The problems were interesting. The solutions required imagination and rigor in equal measure. Every constraint was an invitation. I understood during those months the pleasure that had kept my grandfather at his drafting table every evening until my mother called him for dinner. At the groundbreaking ceremony, with the mountains enormous and white behind the site, and the autumn sun making Denver look briefly like a painting, Daniel found me at the edge of the crowd and handed me a small box. Inside was a watch, not a Hamilton, a newer piece, well-made, good leather strap. On the case back, freshly engraved in Daniel's handwriting, "For Sarah, the one who brought us home. D.H." I stood at that groundbreaking ceremony and did not try not to cry. I wear both watches now, my grandfather's Hamilton on my left wrist where his sat, where the strap still carries that slight looseness from his broader wrist, Daniel's watch on my right wrist. People ask about them sometimes, 2 watches, 1 on each wrist. I tell them it's a professional habit. It is partly true and also entirely not the point. When I arrived at my grandfather's apartment, I picked up a box containing his belongings. I found his journal among his things, ordinary notebook, entries scattered across the years, some years full, some years empty. The last entry, dated November of the year he died, 3 weeks before he was admitted to hospital. "I have given Sarah the watch. She tried not to look too moved by it, which means she was very moved by it. She has her mother's way of concealing what she feels most deeply. She is ready for whatever comes next. I don't know what comes next, but she is ready for it. I hope the world is ready for her. R.W." I read it standing at my kitchen counter in the morning light, read it 3 times, then added an entry of my own beneath his. "Grandpa, you were right. Everything is fine. S.W." The first homes in the Robert Whitfield development were completed the following spring, a quiet ceremony, not a media occasion. 20 families from the city's housing waiting list, each receiving keys to a home that was warm, efficient, built to last, and designed with the same care a draftsman from Colorado Springs gave to every line he ever drew. I stood beside Daniel at the back of the room. I thought about the blueprint in the cardboard box, about 48 years of distance and searching and letters returned unopened, about a gray Tuesday morning, a job interview, a watch on the wrong wrist, about the particular way that love, when it is real and patient, finds its way through every obstacle and silence and closed door. "Well," Daniel said quietly as the last key was handed over and the room broke into applause. "Well," I agreed. Not long after, I ordered an expensive headstone for my grandfather. When he died, there was no money for anything more than a simple flat marker, his name, his dates, nothing else, just the bare fact of him, pressed into the earth. I had stood at that marker the day after the funeral and thought, he deserves more than a fact. He was more than a fact. I found a stone carver in Denver, a quiet man named Ed, who understood without having to explain it to me that I wanted something that would last. We chose Colorado granite, pale gray with faint threads of rose in it, the color of the mountains at a certain hour of morning. Robert James Whitfield, 1941 to 2025. Father, grandfather. Everything will be fine. I called Daniel the following evening when the installation was complete. He arrived the following Saturday with Maggie and all 3 children. We walked together through the older section of Evergreen Cemetery in Colorado Springs, the mountains pale and enormous to the west, and the air carrying that particular smell of dry grass and pine that I had never been able to separate from the memory of my grandfather himself. When we reached the stone, nobody spoke for a moment. Maggie put her hand over her mouth. Ethan looked away briefly and then looked back. Lily reached over and took my hand without saying anything, which was exactly right. Daniel stood very still. He read the inscription twice, carefully, like he had read that letter, like a man making sure of something he already knew but needed to confirm. Then he crouched down and placed his palm flat against the granite and stayed like that for a long moment. I stepped forward. "Rest in peace, Grandpa," I said. "We all love you." It was exactly what he would have wanted. Not the stone, not the inscription, though I believed he would have loved both, but this, the people gathered, the family found, the distance finally closed. Everything will be fine. He had scratched those words on the back of a watch during the hardest winter of his life to steady his own hands. I understood now that he had meant them for all of us. The watch on my left wrist said 3:42. The watch on my right wrist said 3:42. Both second hands swept their quiet, steady circles. Everything is fine. Everything's fine now.
Friends, what do you think of this story? Write your opinion in the comments. Would you like more stories? Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell button so you don't miss any videos. See you tomorrow.